For many, the Roswell UFO crash is simply a story. For others, it's a belief in something larger than ourselves. However, for one family, it is a fact. A legacy handed down through 3 generations, told with verity and certitude. The story of Jesse Marcel Sr. Philip Coppens, historian and author of The Ancient Alien Question, set out on a quest to discover the reality behind Roswell by visiting the one true source, the family of Jesse Marcel.
The UFO phenomenon began on June 24, 1947, when Kenneth Arnold saw 9 flying objects over Mount Rainier in Washington state. Ever since, we have known the term UFOs, unidentified flying objects. But what if a few days later, in early July of 1947, an object crashed in Roswell, New Mexico, and the answer as to what the unidentified stood for became a reality? What if, in Roswell in 1947, extraterrestrial beings crash-landed on planet Earth, and the government has known about it ever since? The story of Roswell only began to get international recognition from the 1980s onwards. What had happened was that in the late 1970s, a few UFO researchers, specifically Stanton Friedman and Bill Moore, also known as William Moore, began to look into this story. William Moore, and together with Charles Berlitz, had just done a fantastic international best-selling book called The Bermuda Triangle. And riding on that success, they were looking for a follow-up. That follow-up became known as the Roswell Incident. It's a book about the possibility whether or not the story of Roswell happened. The story hinges on the testimony of one single person, Jesse Marcel. What had happened was that in their travels as UFO researchers, they had heard this rumor about this one guy who allegedly had handheld some of the material which had happened at a crash site of an extraterrestrial disk near Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. And both Stanton Friedman and Bill Moore went out in search of this man, who at that moment in time was still alive. His name is Jesse Marcel. The story of Jesse Marcel is the core of this documentary. It's the story of 3 generations of the Marcel family, and 3 Jesse Marcels as well at that, who all have been intrigued with whether or not the truth of Roswell should become known. And it's an interesting story, because here we have 2 generations who have handled this material with their own hands. The first person is Major Jesse Marcel. He went to the crash site and brought some of the material back home before he had to take it into the army base. He showed it to his wife, he showed it to his 11-year-old son. Now we have a 3rd generation, Jesse Marcel III, the grandson of Major Jesse Marcel. And he is talking about a lifelong quest to find out what Roswell really is.
It beckons the idea or the thought that, was there actually more to this first site than has been told? My grandfather always, almost with a wink in his eye, was always said there's so much more to the story than I can tell you, so much more than the media or he's told to the newspapers at the time and that kind of thing over the shows he's on. But I really believe there was a lot more to that first crash site than we know about, past the items, past the metal, past those materials. And this is the date we've narrowed this down to is somewhere around July 2nd, late evening of July 2nd. Within a few days before that, people were seeing these things everywhere, describing them blue lights, describing them as saucers, like saucer plates, put together, flying across the sky. Everything from priests to politicians to the police. Everybody was seeing these things flying through the valley. And it was backed up. Radar was finding these targets that would come in and out of range. And it must have been a very fascinating time to be in the desert, to think that all this is going on around you. And again, thinking back this time, UFOs weren't talked about at all. It was nothing. I mean, it was, I think, a fascinating oddity, maybe, but it was nothing, no reality to it. And here was a whole town of people literally seeing these things and thinking there is something strange going on now.
The legacy of Roswell has been handed down through 3 generations, not as an event that may have happened, but as a truth that cannot be denied. And therefore the evidence of Roswell is contained in the experiences of those who were actually there.
For the Marcel family, Roswell is not a question mark, it is not a controversy. There are no unknowns as to whether or not something happened. The question is just a matter of details as to where they came from, what has happened to the material, whether we have somehow benefited as a species from the material which the government secreted from 1947 onwards. But everything else, the truth that something landed in Roswell, is a family legacy which the Marcels have cherished for several decades and continue to do so. They have spoken out before, but now Jesse Marcel is ready to tell all.
He knew what it was, he knew how big it was, and he knew that this kind of story, this kind of information could cause, this kind of information could cost you your life. This technology was very important to our government. It was very, very important that the government kept that information tight to their vest. They did not want it getting out. It was their property, no one else's.
So what happened? For families like the Marcels, the Blanchards, there was never any doubt. This was true, this has happened. And of course there was the evidence in the I-beam in the kitchen a few years or a few months afterwards, when they were holding it and looking at it and seeing this is evidence of what happened. So what for the rest of the world has been speculation, and for very large sections of the world population today continues to be a question mark, for them it is an absolute truth. They know. And the Marcel family are so adamant in getting this out because for them it is a truth which needs to come out into the open.
I have always, as a lot of people have thought about Roswell, why didn't they tell people about this? They felt we couldn't handle it, the people couldn't handle it. I've always thought that doesn't really make a lot of sense. I think people would have loved to have been able to been part of that UFO, that life does exist out there. The wonderment, the fantastic idea that we're not alone. I think it was more of our government knowing that they had a piece of technology that no one else had. And for us to stay on top, and just like any other top secret program, it was going to be kept, and kept very tight. Like when you think about the Mogul balloon, another top secret program. When in history have you ever seen where they release a top secret program to all the newspapers in color? Well, it's black and white. They bring it out, it's in every newspaper, it's on every radio, disclosing all these details about a top secret program. They decided that, well, obviously this Mogul balloon program, although important, had nothing in comparison to what they had found in the desert that day. So it was easy for them to give up a little bit to hold the prize.
In 1947, if the government told you to keep a secret, it was considered your patriotic duty to hold that information. Jesse Marcel Sr. was loyal to his country, and above all else, he was a patriot. During the press conference, Marcel was told to pose with materials from a mogul balloon. Though he knew it was not the materials he had brought back from Corona, he complied with his orders.
That says a couple things about him. One, he could be trusted with information that was obviously very valuable to the war, that they didn't trust, the 99.9% of the people with. And he was one of those people, it tells a little bit about himself and his ability to, you can imagine, I'm about to work with a team, I'm going to tell them where to drop a bomb, it's going to kill thousands and thousands of people. To take that responsibility and to be able to put yourself aside and follow your orders, and that's exactly what he did. He really paid for that later in life.